Well, if you've just watched the Chrysler Crossfire video, then welcome back. This is the optional extra video, and the normal things, there's a link to the original Crossfire video up there somewhere, so that if you got this in the wrong order, you can get the right video. Anyway, the Crossfire, it was an interesting car that I'd seen on the roads, in the past, and I thought I'd look at it, but it also turns out to be, for me, a little bit of a vehicle to talk about the whole Daimler-Chrysler debacle that, that happened in the late 90s. I remember it happening, I remember it failing, didn't know the details. So again, a lot of these videos is me just trying to find out more about what happened and, understand what happened. So the Daimler-Chrysler merger looked good on paper. You have two separate companies that don't really go after the same markets. They can share the same facilities to produce cars. There's potentially, as I said in the video, there's a lot of synergy there. But the problem is that you don't really know what you have until you've done the merger, until you've done a takeover. You can look at a company from the outside, but of course, companies who are potentially competitors don't really want to share all the trade secrets. So there could be out-of-date machinery, there could be out-of-date working practices. If you go and look at Ford and Jaguar, when Ford took over Jaguar in the late 1980s, once they spent an astronomical amount of money buying it, beating out GM in the process, they found out that Jaguar, which had just been privatized after being a public company for a long time, they'd just put no investment into the company at all. So it had out-of-date machinery, it had way too many people doing the jobs that they should be doing. So they were incredibly inefficient, and Ford had to spend an absolute fortune in the next sort of 12, 13 years or so to try and change that, and actually turned Jaguar into a company that could actually survive. But also in the case of Daimler and Chrysler, do you have to have your expectations in sync? Chrysler had decent machinery, it had modern machinery, but the management teams both had completely different expectations. Chrysler was looking for a merger of equals, which they were told they were going to get. Daimler weren't looking for that sort of thing at all. So there was this real disconnect and, of course, problems between the two companies. There are some ways that you can do some due diligence to try and make sure that a merger or a takeover can go more successfully. I come from the software industry, and one thing that two software companies do when they're looking into a merger or a takeover or that sort of thing is they will hire a third party to go look at the source code of the company that's being acquired. And because the source code could be very well maintained, it could be a very elegant way it's done, so it could be maintainable and expandable easily into the future. It could be an absolute mess of code. I once looked at the source code for Solitaire for Microsoft Windows. That is the worst bit of code you have ever seen. It was just like a rat's nest of code. It was done by an intern as an intern project. But anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. So what you would do is you get a third party to go take a look at the source code and report back to say, is it well maintained? Is it a terrible piece of code? And they can tell that sort of thing without giving away too much of the crown jewels of the company that's trying to be acquired. Because obviously these are two hostile companies and they don't want to share too many secrets. And you can do the same thing with engineering companies like car companies. You can go and have a third party go and look at the factories and try and work out exactly what sort of processes they're using. Or maybe go and look at the management teams in case of Daimler Chrysler. Anyway, so Chrysler's management team, I sort of point out in the video, they were very smart. They had done all of these amazing things, taking Chrysler from in the late 70s when they essentially had to be bailed out by the American government. They did the K cars in the 1980s, and by the 1990s, they were really firing on all cylinders. They were doing a really good job. Although I said they're very smart, they weren't that smart because they agreed to the Daimler Chrysler deal. So there you go. That's the one thing I'd point out. I found a video just after I'd done the Chrysler Crossfire video, when I was looking at doing this actually, from the guy who I think is the current Mercedes chairman. And he was actually there during the 1998 merger between Daimler and Chrysler. And he talks a little bit more about the merger, so I thought I'd put it in here.
There was a board where I was a member of, not leading it, but a member of, which decided to join forces with a company which at that time seemed to be strong. We got quite a significant revival with setbacks, but when I saw that there were no firewalls at Daimler Chrysler against any risks in Chrysler whatsoever, there was only one decision for me: to split it immediately, and the risk applied shortly after, and the company went Chapter 11.
So all the sources that I saw about the Daimler-Chrysler merger talk about 2001 and Chrysler just their sales and their revenue falling off a cliff at that point. But one thing they don't point out is that there was a dot-com bubble burst in 2000, and Ford fell in sales at that point. I think GM also fell in sales at that point. It was a common problem. A lot of companies were having problems trying to make money at that point. But what was clear was that by 2003, certainly it was clear that Chrysler was starting to do badly. It may not have been clear by 2001, that may have been revisionist history, but certainly by 2003, it was clear that things were not going well as far as the merger and also as far as their sales and their revenue. So in the early 2000s, Celine Dion did something like a $10 million deal to promote Chrysler's cars. And in the process, when she did the deal, I suppose she thought that I'm trying to promote cars, so maybe on my next album I should have a song about cars so that I could use it in some of the videos. So she did a cover version of a song called I Drove All Night, which you may remember as being a song by Cyndi Lauper, but it was originally a song for Roy Orbison, and Roy Orbison recorded it for his next album. Unfortunately, Roy Orbison tragically died before that album could be released, so his version of the song was released in 1992, which was a few years after the Cyndi Lauper version. So of course, most people don't know he was the original person to potentially do that song. Anyway, Celine Dion recorded it in the early 2000s and used it to promote the Chrysler Crossfire. So anyway, bit of interesting trivia for you there. One thing I didn't maybe make clear about the Chrysler Airflight, that's that sort of 4-door version that looks a little bit like the Chrysler Crossfire, is it didn't go into production, it was just a concept. And that may well be because things were going badly for Chrysler and maybe Crossfire wasn't received maybe as well as they thought, so they decided to can the Airflight. But the Airflight name was like the aerodynamic version of Nash's cars in the late 40s and early 50s. They did an Airflight version of the Nash Rambler and the Nash Ambassador. And I didn't know anything about I don't know a lot about Nash, to be honest. To be honest, I don't know a lot about cars. That's why I do this channel, because I like to learn about it. But the Nash Rambler in the late 40s, early 50s, there's one German site that said it was based on an Austin platform. I can't find too much information about that, so I'm not sure if that's true. But there was a song I found called Beep Beep, which is about a Nash Rambler, and it's from the late 40s, early 50s, or maybe late 50s. It was from a while back. And anyway, it's a fun song. I really enjoyed listening to it. So I'll put a link in the description and somewhere so that you can take a look at it. It's a fun song. And so Daimler and Chrysler in 2007 decide to split, and it was the Daimler side of the business that decides on the split. To be fair, Daimler was still doing fairly well as far as revenue. It was the Chrysler side of the business that wasn't doing very well, and of course the argument could be made that it was because of Daimler's influence that kind of screwed up the whole thing. But the Daimler actually had more shares in the company when they did this merger. Even though it was a merger of equals, of course, there were more Daimler shares than Chrysler shares. So it was Daimler or Daimler's old shareholders that could call for the split, which is why they were doing that. this was Mercedes' bid to go into the mass market. As I pointed out, you've got BMW, Mercedes and Volkswagen, and both BMW and Mercedes are eyeing Volkswagen's mass market size and reach and deciding that they want to do a similar thing. And BMW, it ends in disaster with Rover, although they get the Mini and the Rolls-Royce brands out of it, and they still have those. But Mercedes or Daimler wasn't just purchasing or going into business with Chrysler in the late 90s. In 2000, they did a deal with Mitsubishi to also do some sort of joint tie-up with them. So they were really going for it. They were really trying to become a very large company very quickly. But this whole merger business, which Daimler did in the early 2000s, just seems to have really scared them off any type of merger. If you look at both BMW and Mercedes, neither of them have done any kind of acquisition since around 2000. Neither of them have looked into doing that. They've all tried to organically grow their luxury car business essentially down from going to a high luxury player all the way down to more of the mass market. And of course, there's a big risk doing that you may cheapen the brand. A person who buys an S-Class Mercedes doesn't want to also be next to someone who's driving an A-Class Mercedes. So, but it seems to have worked for both companies. They seem to be retaining that luxury edge as well as also being able to sell to the mass market. And I talk about the fact that Chrysler doesn't do sports cars, and what I mean by that in the video, that the Chrysler brand doesn't do sports cars. Of course, their Dodge brand still does do sports cars. They do the Dodge Charger and the Dodge Challenger, but rather than Art Deco inspired cars, these are 1960s nostalgia fueled cars, just trying to play on when the Dodge Charger and Dodge Challenger were last popular, I suppose. And so finally, Fiat buys Chrysler, and then in 2021, Peugeot Citroën buy Fiat Chrysler and become Stellantis. And the Peugeot Citroën behemoth really wants to do common platforms. And so obviously back in 1998, Daimler Chrysler, they were hoping to do these common platforms, but Peugeot Citroën have got it down to a fine art. They have so many cars they produce off so few platforms. So with this whole merger into Stellantis, you can see they're just going to keep driving to fewer and fewer common platforms and hopefully to drive additional revenue. And so where does this put Mercedes and BMW? Because they're relatively small companies compared to Stellantis, and Stellantis produce a lot of cars, a lot of different cars, only on a few platforms. Mercedes and BMW, they produce relatively few cars off of the platforms that they have. They have a decent amount of volume, but will that impact the sales of Mercedes and BMW in the future? That's something that only time will tell. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this optional extra ramble into the Chrysler Crossfire. I really appreciate you watching. It's lovely to, I quite like the smaller community of people that watch the optional extra videos. It's nice to see the comments that you put out. Usually they're interesting comments that I like looking at. So anyway, I appreciate you watching these videos, and I'll see you in the next video.